Hello everyone, really lovely to see parents, carers and community members. I am Kate Spencer-Ellis and I'm the head of sixth form here at Forest School. Welcome to this webinar on avoidant behaviour in young people. We're not expecting any technological difficulties this evening, but if we do encounter any, please do bear with us. Before I introduce this evening's speaker, I'd like to signpost you to our next webinar after half-term, focused on our RSAG provision here at Forest, specifically focusing on how as a school we will prepare for the update statutory guidance, which comes into effect from September 2026, and what this means for our provision here at Forest. Now to our speakers this evening. I'm really excited to hear from Catherine Hayes-Fisher, who is the Regional Clinical Lead for Place to Be, the children's mental health charity, overseeing all therapeutic work taking place within our projects from the London and West region. She brings huge experience from within and outside the organisation as a trainer, supervisor and counsellor, having worked with children and adults on behalf of the NHS, the Sure Start Centre, YMCA and educational settings across all stages in both the state and private sector. We're also really fortunate this evening to hear first from our fabulous Place to Be project manager, Amanda Gale, who many of you will be familiar with. So I'm going to start off by handing over to Amanda, who is going to talk you through her first slide. Thank you, Amanda.
Thank you, Kate, for that lovely introduction. Good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us tonight. I am Amanda Gale. I'm the Place to Be School project manager here at Forest, and I'm really pleased to welcome you to this webinar on avoidant tendencies in teenagers and young people. Avoidant tendencies being something we're seeing much more frequently in school and in our therapeutic work here at Place to Be. So over recent months, what we've noticed are some patterns, and that some of the young people we're seeing are beginning to withdraw from tasks they would previously have managed confidently. So things like handing in assignments or homework, attending certain lessons, participating in group work, or even interacting with peers or attending activities. And we're also seeing an increase in students seeking to leave the classroom due to feeling overwhelmed or delaying starting work because they're worried it won't be good enough. These behaviours, they're not about laziness. They're often a sign that a young person is struggling to cope with uncomfortable feelings or internal pressure. So I just want to highlight something really important about avoidance, because for many young people, avoiding a difficult task, situation, or a difficult feeling will offer a moment of relief. So in the short term, stepping away from something stressful or uncomfortable can feel soothing. And then the tricky thing is that relief is only temporary. The uncomfortable feelings, whether it's the anxiety, the self-doubt, the fear of getting something wrong, they won't go away. They tend to come back, but maybe even stronger the next time the young person faces a similar situation. So then we have the avoidance cycle where there's a worry, it's avoided, a little bit of relief, and then a bigger worry next time round. So over time, this cycle can make everyday situations feel so much harder, and the young person can start to feel really overwhelmed so much more easily. So that is why understanding avoidance is so crucial. And our focus tonight is on building compassionate understanding and practical strategies so you feel equipped, supported, and connected to what your child may be experiencing. So my email address is up there if you ever wish to contact me about anything to do with your children's emotional well-being. I'm here to listen. And I'm now going to hand you over to Catherine, who will be delivering the webinar tonight. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Amanda. I'm Catherine Hayes-Fisher. I'm a member of the senior clinical team at Place to Be. And thank you, Amanda, too, for that introduction and for setting the context currently at Forest School that's led to this webinar that I'm going to be delivering tonight. So thank you to all of you who have joined this evening for carving out time from your busy schedules to join us for the webinar on avoidant behaviours in teenagers, in which we're going to explore why these happen, what sits beneath them, and how you as parents can support your child at home. One of the key messages tonight to take away can be that avoidance is incredibly common and can especially be so in high-performing schools such as Forest, where no matter how well-intentioned, expectations and pressures can be intensely felt by our young people. So my aim tonight is to make this feel understandable, normalized and manageable. So, as I said just now, a key message is that avoidance is incredibly common in adolescence and is usually a communication of distress rather than the laziness or defiance that it may appear to be, or that we might interpret it as adults involved with that young person, or experience it as in the moment. So tonight is really about understanding why avoidance happens and what you can practically do at home. And I want to touch again on what I said just now, which is just to acknowledge the context of Forest School. Academically demanding, with high achieving students and highly educated parents. This carries many strengths: motivation, aspiration, opportunities. I think it's also important to recognise that for our young people, it can also increase pressure, perfectionist tendencies, and a fear of failure. And we do tend to see avoidance crop up more in these environments, often masked behind high performance. So when we're thinking about avoidant behaviours, what exactly might these look like? Avoidance can show up in many different ways: academically, socially, emotionally, and behaviourally. So some examples of each might include a particularly challenging and deep-rooted example might be what we call emotionally based school avoidance, where a young person is regularly struggling to come into school. And we'll touch more upon that later on in the webinar. Alternatively, you might see a young person struggling to attend or really avoiding specific lessons, specific days within the week, and partial attendance patterns may begin to emerge. You might find that your young person is regularly avoiding homework, procrastinating, putting off school-related things, which might include homework, or it might include getting ready for school, generally sort of delaying tactics. And when discussing school-related things, you might notice a sort of freezing tendency in your young person, or just a standard reply of, I don't know. If we look at socially avoidant behaviours, these might include withdrawing or spending increased periods of time in their room. It's important to say that actually for adolescents, some of this is entirely normal. What our job is as the adults most closely involved with these young people is to really sort of tune in and pick up on a change, and particularly sustained changes in behaviour. So we might find our young people avoiding group activities, becoming increasingly isolated, going out less, and sort of generally avoiding connecting with others. Emotionally, we might find that they communicate less, and in particular, avoiding conversations around feelings, or an increased tendency to be irritable or be angry as a sort of deflection away from conversations around how they're feeling. Or you might find them shutting down and issuing that sort of standard reply of, I'm fine. Behaviourally, as we've said, sort of staying off school, lessons and avoiding certain people may become a pattern. Or you might find that your young people begin to replace things that they should be doing or are expected of them with particular activities, such as gaming, but it could be many other things as well. And again, it's not to say that these activities per se are inappropriate or unhealthy, but it's when we get a feeling as a parent, carer, teacher, that these young people are pursuing these activities relentlessly, perhaps in avoidance of something else. So the invitation here is to really tune into your child's behaviors, recognize these patterns and tendencies, and consider what they might be trying to communicate through their behavior, something potentially that they can't yet put into words. So why do teens use avoidance? And there are many different underlying factors which could lead to avoidant behaviours, and we're going to look at several of these tonight. One of the biggest drivers is undoubtedly anxiety. So when something feels overwhelming or risky, such as tests, exams, peer relationships, general expectations, a young person might resort to avoidance. They might choose to play it safe rather than risk failing or invite judgment, or out of a fear of actually being unable to cope. In some young people, they may be avoiding because of a fear of a sensory overload. And we'll say more about that later on, and the young people that this particularly tends to affect. And as Amanda touched on earlier in her introduction, avoiding is not a bad strategy temporarily, because in the short term, it will bring about the effect of reducing anxiety levels. They don't do something, they feel immense relief, the brain goes, that worked. And the trouble is, that makes it more likely that they'll do it again. In high achieving teens, anxiety may be hidden under competence or perfectionism. Your young people may be very capable and really want to do well. In many cases, they probably are doing well, but it may be that there's more of an emotional cost than has initially been apparent. So avoidance can begin in these circumstances to creep in. And the important thing to be aware of is it's not because our young people don't care, it's because they care a great deal. So moving on, we'll look at some other potentially underlying factors with avoidant behaviours. Where a young person is experiencing low mood or depression, this can have the effect of making tasks just feel pointless or exhausting. Their motivation drops, social withdrawal increases, and avoidance again becomes that form of protection. And stress and cognitive overload are also big contributors. Academic pressure can be a contributory factor here. Friendship dynamics, and I think we all recognise that peer relations can have some very challenging episodes that are very, very impactful for our young people. Identity formation is going on within this age range. For some, this is a very easy pathway, but for others, that discovery of who they are, where their interests lie, making the choices that the system expects of them and society, and emerging sexuality can be a much bumpier road leading to overload. And perfectionist tendencies can also be a potential factor. So when the brain is overloaded, for any one of those reasons, avoidance is the natural response, not a behavioural choice so much as an unconscious desire for self-protection. And of course, they're some of the more generalised underlying factors. We'll look now at a few slightly more individualised contributory factors. So avoidance can also originate from trauma or difficult life events that we wish our young people didn't have to go through, but in some cases, unavoidably, they are navigating extremely challenging events in their young lives. School can trigger memories for some. There might be relational stress or generally overwhelm that are all connected to sort of traumatic life events. And we also need to consider here neurodivergent young people, in particular those with ADHD and autism. And I think it's important to note at this point that we're not just talking about those young people who have a formal diagnosis of neurodivergence, but the many young people who, for whatever reason, have not yet, whether or not they're on a pathway, on a waiting list, it hasn't manifested itself in a way that's been picked up or recognised at this point. But we know that there are more neurodivergent young people in society than has previously been thought to be the case. And when it comes to school, we also know that schools are invariably designed for neurotypical children. So I would say that there is a chance that our neurodivergent young people are more at risk of avoidant behaviours than neurotypical young people. In particular, they may experience some executive functioning challenges around timekeeping, organisation, and meeting deadlines. They may be experiencing a sensory overload in the form of smells, sights, sounds, and noise, where environmental adaptations aren't yet in place or aren't in place sufficiently to really meet their needs. And again, we need to think about school here as an environment in which it is particularly sensorially overwhelming, or can be. There's also that risk of unpredictable social situations which life, school, home life can all too often present. I remember working with a young person many years ago who had some avoidant tendencies, particularly socially, and with an anxiety sort of basis, and yet could hold down a Saturday job in Cafe Nero very easily. And when exploring that with this young person, they said, because it's predictable. By and large, a customer would come to the counter, there's an informal script, they place their order, it's time limited, there's a little bit of exchange around money, and then they move on. And this is entirely manageable, or was to this young person, as opposed to a school playground, a party, a wider family event where you're not quite in control of who's coming up to you or what they might say and what the requirement will be of you in response. So these can be extremely stressful, particularly for neurodivergent children. And in their attempt to conform, adapt, fit in, and please, an awful lot of masking might go on, which is just exhausting. So at some point, with the brain trying to cope, avoidance becomes the natural conclusion for some of these young people, rather than it being a poor behavioural choice. So Our final sort of underlying factor that we're going to look at this evening is perfectionism, something that I've mentioned a couple of times already. And this can be a huge theme in independent schools. I've seen it myself in work that I've done in either high achieving schools or in independent schools. And it's important to remember that it comes in both helpful but also in less helpful forms. There's the adaptive, sort of helpful form of perfectionism, if you like, where a young person really wants to do well and puts in that necessary effort, feels proud of achievements, and so they strive hard, they're organised, they're motivated to succeed, really responding to the environment around them and the expectations being set possibly at home or school. But there can equally be a maladaptive perfectionism where a young person within the same context just becomes incredibly fearful of making mistakes, of failure. And in these cases, they may just start to avoid whatever is being asked of them. It may lead to an emotional shutdown, sort of stemming really from the belief that if I can't do it perfectly, I won't do it at all. So Albert Bandura's self-efficacy theory can help us understand this a little better. If a task feels too risky, and when we use that word, we're really talking about emotional risk, the young person protects their sense of self by avoiding it altogether. So to be clear, for a child or young person presenting in this way, the goal isn't to remove the high standards. That's not what we're saying, but it's to remove the fear attached to making mistakes. And making mistakes, after all, is such an important experience to have and to clock up in youth. It's important when we're learning, it's part of the process, and also in the development of life skills, and having the tools, the resilience, the resources to overcome challenges and setbacks. And if we avoid situations which, because out of a fear of failure, we're not learning and or developing those skills. So perfectionism is another example of a sort of where avoidance becomes a protective factor in a way that is unhelpful. So we're going to take a moment now to think about the adolescent brain and the part it plays in the emergence of avoidant behaviours. Because in adolescence, as I'm sure many of you will be aware, the brain is still developing and in an uneven way. The emotional centre, the amygdala, develops earlier than the planning and regulation centre, the prefrontal cortex. This sort of misalignment between the two parts continues into a young person's probably mid-20s, resulting in teens feeling emotions intensely and sometimes struggling to think logically in the moment. So whatever precautionary conversations might have taken place that you might have held with your young people around a risky situation, a situation that feels like it might carry risks for them emotionally, where they're able to think through steps they might take if it all becomes a bit overwhelming, or to talk logically and rationally about it. In the moment, through no fault of their own, but because of this misaligned, uneven brain development, all this rationale and logic goes out of the window, and therefore the resources to cope follow suit. So avoidance really fits into that sort of fight, flight, freeze system, the automatic survival-based reaction to perceived danger or acute stress. The avoidance really sitting within that freeze, flight response. Again, your child isn't being difficult, but their brain is overwhelmed. So let's look at this within the cycle of avoidance and how it develops. So your young person may, for a variety of reasons, as we've seen, face a situation that for them feels overwhelming or stressful. So a discomfort comes in to their bodies, to their minds, to how they're feeling. The sort of unconscious result, therefore, or the natural choice is for them to avoid that situation. And guess what? The anxiety drops. It worked. How successful. Brilliant. The trouble is, by avoiding, they haven't challenged any of their thinking around that situation. They haven't built up a counter evidence base that shows them that actually they didn't really need to worry that much, and they haven't factored in that actually they might quite enjoy it also. So they're just stuck with the, no, it's scary, it's too much, it's risky, and avoidance worked. So surprise, surprise, next time they're faced with a similar situation, it feels even harder to participate, making the tendency to avoid increase even further. The more completions of the cycle of avoidance that a young person goes through, and the longer it continues, the bigger the scary thing looms within the teenager's mind. So our goal as the adults around these young people supporting them isn't to push them suddenly into the fear, but it's to slowly break the cycle through graded, supported steps. So we're going to move on at this point to really think about what helps, and hope that you'll go away from tonight with some practical tips to support your young people. So when your child is presenting with some of the behaviours that we have looked at this evening, and you're beginning to feel concerned about some emerging patterns, the real key is to stay curious rather than confrontational. Rather than interrogating what they're doing and why, it's more about noticing and reflecting. I notice that it seems hard for you too. It seems that this has become difficult. Naming the situation specifically. And you can, in this way, begin to think together about the situation. This is far better than the kind of, look, you just need to get on with it, which is so easily said in the heat of the moment when we're all busy, and we do generally just need them to do it and make life easy for us. But actually that is not true to their own needs or meeting our young people's needs, and is likely to just invite defensiveness and shut down. What we're trying to do is to open up a discussion that will help both of you sort of move through it to a happier state. So trying things like, what part of this feels hard, or how can I help with that first small step? Inquiring about specific difficulties that you see they're facing at the moment, such as, is there something about school that's worrying you right now? Another tip is to really break tasks down into tiny steps. It's all too easy for us as adults to bring our adult sense of a task. You know, children have got to go to school, children have got to do their homework. It's so easy to think in this way. And, you know, as I was saying earlier, you just need to get on with it. It's what everyone does. This is not really meeting the individual need in a helpful way. What might seem straightforward for us as parents, that they just get on with their homework, may feel overwhelming. So actually breaking it down into small steps is better. Rather than start your homework, which may just feel too big and invite overwhelming feelings, how about let's clear a space at the table where you can work? How about you open your laptop? What about finding a worksheet that you can start your homework on? And the important thing is to praise the effort bit by bit as they go along. Really notice it and validate it, rather than falling into that trap of just praising the outcome. Validating a young person's feelings cannot be overstated. All too often, young people, particularly teenagers, feel so alone, like they are the only ones, misunderstood, and nobody else is feeling the same way. I'm sure one of those statements will ring true with many of you, either from your own experience as an adolescent or with your young people. What can be helpful is to really reflect back to them when they've sort of, you know, if you go back to tip 1 and you've been curious and you know, you've started a sort of two-way dialogue and really begun to try and understand, you know, what is feeling hard for them right now, then to respond with a, that makes sense that you're feeling overwhelmed, and normalizing it in that way is incredibly powerful for a young person. Not just in normalizing and showing them that you're interested and you've heard, but it also reduces any shame or defensiveness that they might be experiencing. Another really important factor is co-regulation before expectation. Again, as parents, in the evening, we might be juggling, spinning so many different plates. We might have had an extremely difficult day. We might have all sorts of additional responsibilities, time pressures, and demands upon us in any one moment. And a young person displaying with avoidant behaviours thrown into that mix can be extremely difficult. Your calm, however, will have a very significant positive effect on your young people. It will help to regulate them if you can first regulate yourself. So self-awareness here is really, really key. And I will absolutely share and own that avoidant behaviours can elicit a very strong negative response in us as parents, especially when we have invested financially, emotionally in our children. It's really important to remember they're not expressing ingratitude or rejection. It's more likely to be stress, overload, anxiety. So when we come up against that challenging response to an expectation, if we can just, as adults, take a moment, perhaps offer them a drink and a moment of connection before we talk about expectations. It's connection first that is more likely to lead to positive results. And sort of helping your child to become unstuck, I suppose. So gentle exposure is so much more important and more helpful than forcing a young person into the outcome we're hoping to see. So shorten the task, break it down, as we said, and where possible, and I know that you'll be juggling many things, but where possible and realistic, stay alongside them. You know, is it possible to sit, for example, at a table with them whilst they work? Can you be preparing supper? Can you be doing some admin yourselves so that we're not sending them off to their room to work in isolation for hours at a time, where they're just left struggling with their avoidant tendency and overwhelm? Can it become a more sort of collaborative exercise, so that we're not asking them to perform, but to participate in an activity? A key thing is to reduce those routine stress points. You'll soon see, is it the evenings, is it the mornings, you know, is it the meal times, is it the Sunday nights? Where are those stress points coming? What are they telling us about your young person's internal experiencing? But what practical steps, more significantly, can you take as a family to alleviate some of those stress points to the benefit of all? Preparation the night before, well ahead of bedtime, so people can draw a line under anything, for example, school related, and really facilitate a better night's sleep. Predictable routines really help to reduce anxiety. And creating that predictability and routines sort of leads on from that. Consistent sleep is vital. Visual timetables can help, displayed in a sort of communal space, so that your young person can be autonomous and see what is needed each day for school, for example, but where they also know that others have got eyes on it and are there as backup as they're trying to implement strategies to support. A regular homework slot within the evening and at weekends, because routines such as these really create a sense of emotional safety. And remember, above all, to try to separate your teenager from their behaviour. They're not giving you a hard time, they're having a hard time. This parenting mantra can be really helpful to hold in mind and repeat to yourself in those most challenging moments, because if you're thinking it, you're more likely to be communicating and modelling it, and that builds compassion and connection, which is vital if change is going to take place. We're moving towards the last few slides in my presentation tonight. And I'm just going to look at sort of those cases where things become a little bit more serious when we're thinking about avoidant behaviours and adolescence, and where and who to go to, what steps you might take in those situations. So emotionally based school avoidance, which is sometimes also known as emotionally based school non-attendance, is how we describe a young person these days who is persistently having difficulty in attending school due to emotional distress rather than other factors. This is likely to have anxiety as its underlying cause, although the reasons for that anxiety may, as we sort of touched on earlier, be rooted or stem from a variety of sources. We see EBSA across all types of schools. It can, again, be present in high achieving schools such as Forest. But there's a spectrum, and that's also really important to bear in mind here. Because at one end, we may have, or your young people may be attending school regularly, but actually still experiencing symptoms of EBSA. It's important, therefore, to really tune in to behaviours and what's going on for your young people, to sort of be alert to partial attendance patterns emerging, which, if they go unrecognised or unsupported, could potentially develop into something more serious. And in these situations, early identification and gentle support can lead to much better outcomes than waiting for crisis and full withdrawal. I think it's also really important with EBSA to be aware that because you can have, because of this spectrum, young people being out of school, young people being in school, but also experiencing symptoms, that it's important to recognise that persistent absence on the one hand and attendance without support in place can actually lead to the same outcome. So, if your young child, for example, is doing fine in school, grades are great, attendance is great, parents' evening is a joy, but they come home and they start to melt down every night, that kind of curious conversation and real attunement to what is going on for that young person, whether or not it's school related, is really important, because it may be that they are masking something that has that is not being picked up currently, and it's important then to sort of join the dots between your young person and school staff to advocate for them. So on that note, seeking extra support would be a good idea where avoidance patterns creep in and become persistent over a number of weeks, or patterns are beginning to emerge, or where your young person is becoming really distressed or shutting down, because remember, there is an acting out and acting in, which it is just a reflection sometimes of individual character, but it may be communicating the same thing, which is distress. If your young person begins to express a new sense of just hopelessness, then that's a situation in which we would encourage you to reach out for some further support. And where there's a sudden sort of big change to either sort of sleep or appetite. So the support routes that we would recommend in examples such as these is to the pastoral team at Forest, be it form tutor or head of house, or obviously the wonderful Amanda at Place to Be, who would be able to advise and assess and make some recommendations. And obviously externally, depending on the nature of the problem as you see it, there is support in the form of your GP and external mental health providers. But where we're attuned and picking up and identifying early and able to intervene, you're likely to see better results sooner than waiting for things for the young person to feel unmanageable. So in conclusion, tonight, avoidance is a communication rather than a failure. Small steps towards progress beat big leaps. And our teens do best when the adults around them remain calm, curious, and connected. Connection first, expectation second. Thank you very much for listening. That's the end of my webinar tonight.